Well, a little bit ago we talked about glycolysis and said you have a couple of different options after glycolysis. You can ship the pyruvate to your mitochondria, get a lot more ATP, or you can do fermentation. Now it's time for the fermentation part. There's a lot of different styles, as you might expect, of fermentation. And a lot of them produce some pretty bizarre and sometimes smelly byproducts, especially in bacteria. So when you sniff that container, you're kind of whiffing for some suspicious fermentation byproducts. But we're just going to focus on two. Both of them are important to our lives. Now, it may seem weird to think of yourself as fermenting, but if you've ever done any weightlifting or sprinting or anything where your muscles started to burn, you did lactic acid fermentation. And we'll also focus on alcoholic fermentation that also has certain applications in our lives. We don't do alcoholic fermentation. Life might be really interesting if we did. Well, let's take a look. We should ask ourselves why we would bother with fermentation. So we just did glycolysis, and we have a couple of pyruvate. Shouldn't we just feed those to the mitochondria? Well, unfortunately, they're on strike because we don't have enough oxygen. So they're not going to make ATP. That's not an option. Plus, we got this passive-aggressive note from enzyme number 6 that we need to restock our supplies of NAD+, and they're not going to work either unless we have NAD+. Who's enzyme number 6 anyway? Okay, I remember now. Enzyme number 6, right over here in glycolysis. And it needed 2 NAD+ molecules to make more NADH. Okay, that enzyme number 6. That makes sense. So both these fermentation reactions come down to getting more of this. Because if we're accepting electrons from our food molecules and extracting them, and we convert all of our NAD+ to the reduced form, NADH, then all we have is NADH, and we're out of this. Normally, NADH goes into the electron transport system, dumps off its electrons, oxygen ends up with them, and we just keep going. But with this one, it's all backed up because there's not an infinite amount of this stuff inside of a cell. So fermentation is about recycling this so that we can keep the rest of glycolysis going and keep making ATP. Let's take a look starting with lactic acid fermentation. Here we have lactic acid fermentation that starts with glycolysis, and we have the pyruvate. I'm going to show you a little more chemical detail about pyruvate here, which is reduced by NADH. It's going to give up its electrons, give them 2 pyruvate, which then becomes lactate or lactic acid. Notice the change formed here. There's more hydrogen than there was before, and that's because of the new bonds formed by accepting electrons. Well, since NADH gave up its electrons, that allowed it to revert to NAD+, which can then return to good old enzyme number 6 and help glycolysis to finish its job. So we do lactic acid fermentation, but not everywhere. We do it mainly in our fast twitch muscles and red blood cells. Different reasons for each. So fast twitch muscles are those kind of bulky muscles that you see on weightlifters, not on long distance runners, but sprinters and weightlifters. They're full of glycogen to supply lots of glucose because we're just going to burn through it real quick without producing much ATP and just depend on lactic acid fermentation because there's just not time to do the complete process of aerobic cellular respiration. Not time to get all that oxygen delivered. So it's kind of a short duration thing. You can't sit and, curl 50 pounds all day long. Lactic acid fermentation is kind of to bridge that gap until you can get back into aerobic respiration mode. You'll cover that more when you get into anatomy and physiology. The other cells that depend on this for us are red blood cells. They don't have any mitochondria because if they did, they would use up all the oxygen that they're supposed to deliver. So instead, they do lactic acid fermentation. Fortunately, their energy needs are a lot lower than muscles, so they don't use up all of that glucose as well. In addition to us, there are several types of bacteria that produce lactic acid. When you eat cheese, that sort of acidic flavor that you get is because bacteria have converted lactose into lactic acid as they ferment. Let's move on and take a look at alcoholic fermentation, which is done by a different set of organisms, not us. But plants do this, and a lot of fungi do this, as well as a few bacteria. Alcoholic fermentation, as you can see, is pretty similar to lactic acid fermentation, except we undergo two reactions. So let's start with this pyruvate here. So we have reaction 1 and reaction 2. The first reaction gives off carbon dioxide, and we get a 2-carbon molecule, which then is reduced, again giving up electrons from NADH to form ethanol or ethyl alcohol. This is the same stuff that is produced in beer and wine and other alcoholic products, usually by yeast. NAD+ is regenerated, allowing glycolysis to continue. The other thing that we might note here is we have those CO2 bubbles. So, for example, in beer, we keep those bubbles, and that adds to the carbonation. When you do bread making, we actually do the same thing. The starch is chopped into sugars, which undergo fermentation, and all these bubbles get trapped inside, creating those air pockets inside the bread. The alcohol, on the other hand, is baked off. Well, there's fermentation for you. And like I said, those two just scratch the surface. There's a lot of organisms that fermentation is really their only means of energy production. For us, it's really kind of a way to get by for a little bit and keep operating, at least with our muscles, until we can get back into aerobic respiration mode. But we need to keep making ATP even if we're running low on oxygen. For other cells, like our red blood cells, it's a little more of a normal mode of operation. Most of our cells use mitochondria, make lots of ATP, but fermentation definitely has a place in our lives. Well, that's it for this time. Till next time, keep appreciating life in all its variety.